Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the reports that Labour's going to try and force the government to publish which schools have a high risk of collapsing, potentially killing students, staff, as a result of their failure to continue the investment in new school buildings that was underway before the Tories came to power. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So when Labour were last in power, they launched a couple of programmes designed to rebuild school buildings. It began with the BSF, or the Building Schools for the Future. I was a teacher at the time. I was very much immersed in that process. Schools and colleges alike were suddenly phased construction sites as old crumbling buildings were replaced with new modern ones. And I have to be honest, I didn't think that some of them were all that practical, I have to say. You know, they almost seem designed more to be fancy looking than ideal for educational purposes. But that was my view. And you know what? It was nothing to do with the government. School and college boards decided with the architects what the building was going to look like, not ministers. The point is that money came rolling in to build new schools. And it wasn't just a manifesto promise with excuses being made later on. It happened pretty much straight after the election in which it was promised. And it was happening in different parts of the country, and it was going to be rolled out across the whole country over time. Then in 2010, the Tories came to power. The then Education Secretary, Michael Gove, put an immediate stop to it. I mean, within a matter of weeks. I worked at one college where they were halfway through and it was stopped. Now, a week ago, 30p Lee Anderson was boasting that Sunak had given his area new money for school buildings. He said this wouldn't have happened under Labour. It did happen under Labour. And it wasn't just money that was given to areas controlled by the party of government either. It was everywhere. Or as I say, it would have been if the programme had been completed. It only got a few years' use. It was stopped by the Tories. And as I say, it wasn't stopped by the Tories a few years into their time in power immediately and not replaced. The Tories engaged in a lengthy programme of cutting public expenditure to the bone. Now, take education. You cut funding for education, what is the first thing that has to fall by the wayside? Buildings, estates. You know, whether it be rebuilding or even just maintenance, that is the first thing to go when you cut any expenditure. Because if you were to cut classroom resources or staff, you would have an immediate negative impact on the teaching and learning taking place. Cut back on the estates and you have a problem a few years down the line. And you can hope that maybe some money will come your way before that few years down the line. Well, it is now a few years down the line, quite a few years down the line. In fact, it's so bad that schools and colleges have had to cut the expenditure, which does harm teaching outcomes. You know, staff are having to be removed effectively. You know, they're having to do without a full complement of staff and other resources. You know, in fact, we're seeing this in the public sector in general. Last year, we were getting news of hospitals needing to prop up their roofs and ceilings because there was a danger of imminent collapse. Replacing these with the 40 supposedly new hospitals would have been handy, but the funding for that was never coming from a Tory government. Even Liz Truss complained about this being the case in her own constituency. Not that her ill-fated mini-budget proposed anything to deal with the issue once she was in power. But back to schools. And there seems to have been a survey carried out in order to highlight the most at-risk buildings. The report was supposed to be published quite soon, but the Department for Education seemed to think they'd rather not publish it at all. So now Labour are going to force them to do so. That would mean that parents would find out if their school is listed as one which poses as a risk to life. That's how serious it is, as a risk to life as a result of part of the building simply collapsing. Now, according to an article I was reading a few weeks ago on this, some schools are considered highly likely to collapse now. And yet this is another example of both the callous disregard that the Tories have, but also the stupidity. You know, even if they do not care about the lives of people, and austerity and COVID proved that, they must know what would happen to themselves if they allowed disaster to strike here. Let us look at a few scenarios, ramping up. First scenario, a block collapses overnight. Nobody's there, nobody's harmed. But people will ask what would have happened had it been during the school day. That is children, teachers, maybe others who could have been killed. And because the same risk will exist in quite a few other schools, it won't be a one-off, as highlighted in this report. that the government are attempting to hide. It'll be easy to show that the government are so unfit for purpose that they are literally risking the lives of our children through their penny pinching. The government will fire back by saying that they are funding school buildings over the next 10 years, but Labour will ask, well, why did it stop for so long? Why did they stop the building programme that was already underway when they came to power in 2010 and for which you can already see, well, they're not new now, but new school buildings at the time, they're fine, they're not in danger of collapse. Why didn't you continue it? Or if you didn't like it, replace it with something just as fit for purpose? Why have you only now started to talk about funding when you think you might lose the next election? I would suggest this would be a major blow for the Conservatives from which they would find it very difficult to recover. And I don't just mean in time for the next election, but for a very long time. Because they would literally be seen as a threat to the safety of their children. And that would be without the other Tory policies coming home to roost right now. So then let's consider the second scenario, ramp it up a bit. Consider that there was a collapse, but that it did happen during the school day. Consider that it did result in deaths. All of the consequences with the first scenario apply, plus there is now children's blood on the Tories' hands. I mean, that would have to be the end of them as a political force for some considerable time. They must be insane to allow this to be happening. Past Conservative governments have always been ambivalent towards ordinary people, but they sort of know that it's a very bad look to actively murder people with their policies. But since 2010, it is really remarkable just how little they've cared to observe these previous boundaries. I think the reason is that they felt they could blame others, and if they could blame others, they can get away with it. So they blamed austerity on the previous Labour government. That worked far longer than it should have done due to a lack of robust argument from Labour itself. Then they blamed the next period of shit on Remainers delaying the Brexit process. Oh, we could have just done it tidily and we'd all be fine. No, Remainers moaning. Now we're in the period where they're blaming COVID and the war in Ukraine for everything. And while they think they can just blame someone or something else, they obviously feel they can get away with not governing. But who or what are they going to blame for a collapsed school building which was years in the making? They will struggle to blame the last Labour government because they will say, we were rebuilding schools. The money was there. It was happening. Schools were built. We can see them. And more were on the way. And that the Tories ended this programme within a matter of weeks of coming to power. This one they will own. They will have to. But then there's a third scenario that could be even worse. Ramp it up again. Let us say there's a collapse, happens during the school day, children are killed. Let us say the collapse happens at one of the schools identified in this report, but that the government have prevented the publication of the report. So let's say it happens in the next few days. The government are actively seeking to prevent the publication of this report. Obviously, the report will come out at some point. The parents of the dead children will then find out, because it'll be all over the media, they will then find out that the school was listed in the report and that the report should have been published, in which case they would have been able to see the risks themselves. These parents would have had the opportunity to assess the risk of sending their children to that school and could, if they felt the risk too great, pull them out. But the government denied them that choice by hiding the report. That would be the most damaging outcome of all. The government are not just acting with reckless disregard for life here, but with the most incredible naivety and stupidity. And it's the same attitude that Johnson had. He had this mindless optimism that made him ignore the need for preventative action. We don't need preventative action because what if it never happens? We've just wasted a load of money on the preventative action. Why don't we wait for the disaster to happen? Because it probably never happen and then deal with it. It's a hoping for the best attitude against all odds that is only possible for the most privileged, entitled brats ever to become ministers who never have to suffer severe consequences for failing to act in their own lives. Because whenever they feel like not doing something in their own lives, and they should have done, the consequences are not severe. And we have someone else. We may think that Rishi Sunak appears a little bit more grounded, but is he really? He is again someone who grew up in the most privileged circumstances and has no idea what it's like to suffer the severe consequences of not acting properly. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.